All right, well, in this session, as you can tell from the title slide and what I said last time, we're going to talk about spiritual warfare. And specifically, we're going to talk about the Old Testament roots to the idea. So it is not, as the slide says, just a New Testament idea. And you might wonder, okay, like, where is spiritual warfare taught? I mean, if you had something like Logos or you had a concordance, and let's say you were in Deuteronomy 32:17, and your English translation had demons there for shadim. If you searched for that term, it only occurs one other place. So you only have two references to shadim in the whole, Old Testament Hebrew Bible. So that isn't much. And again, this is what you'll read in a lot of sort of standard treatments of the cosmic powers of darkness or demonology when it comes to the Old Testament. That it doesn't really know this sort of thing. Now, what I'm going to show you, again, is going to contradict that. And I will mention a few things as we go. Again, if you're interested in the subject, maybe we'll get it in Q&A or what. But I want to start sort of with a little story, a little confession again. When I got out of high school, I went to Bible college. So I went to Bible college for 3 years. And I finished my undergrad at a liberal arts Christian university. Took some Bible classes there. I wound up having a double major in Bible and history. So I had, we'll call it 5 years. And I went to seminary a total of 2 years, 1 year at two different places. So now we're up to 7 years before I hit, secular graduate school. And I wound up going to graduate school at Penn for Egyptology and ancient history, and then Wisconsin for Hebrew and Semitic languages. But in the 5 years, or 7 years, that I had in evangelical institutions studying Bible, this is not an exaggeration, I had 1 clock hour, not credit hour, like a 1 credit class that lasts for 15 weeks. No, I had 1 clock hour, 60 minutes of instruction on angels and demons in 7 years. Now, at the time, you don't think anything about that. As time went on, what sort of soaks into your head is, well, if this stuff were important, or if there was anything to really think about here, they would spend more time on it. 60 minutes in 7 years. Okay, there's a lot more to think about than 60 minutes in 7 years. And a lot of it is just either omitted intentionally. I don't think that's the case with most things. I think it's just missed because we tend to, even with our professors, we tend to sort of perpetuate this subject the way we were taught it, and then we just sort of mimic, what we're doing to the next generation, our students and whatnot. So this, I would venture to say, unless you've read Unseen Realm and especially the Demons book, it's going to be new. And you can always read those books again to get the details. But typically, if I asked about spiritual warfare, you would think, oh, okay, the serpent, Satan, the fall, maybe Job 1 and 2, because we have, in English Bibles, capital S, Satan in Job 1 and 2. Some will say the adversary, which is actually better. But you might sort of mentally default there. A lot of people will think of Daniel 10. And so for the time that we have today, this is where I'm actually going to start. In Daniel 10, we have, this is a familiar passage, but let me just, right here, scrolls a little bit too fast. We have Daniel in conversation with a supernatural being. And the being says, "The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia." And if you go down, we've got this figure mentioned again, Prince of Persia. "I will return to fight against the Prince of Persia. When I go out, behold, the Prince of Greece will come." So a lot of Bible students are familiar with Daniel 10, that we have supernatural princes that are associated with national entities, geopolitical entities. And we know they're supernatural because the one they're fighting against is Michael, who is the Prince of Israel. We find that out in Daniel 12. Michael is one of the chief princes. Later, Jewish literature are going to refer to Michael and these other chiefs as archangels and whatnot. So a lot of people are going to think, okay, spiritual warfare, it must be Daniel 10. That must be the place in the Old Testament where this sort of kicks into gear. Of course, Daniel's really late in the biblical storyline. They're in exile. And it creates this impression that there isn't a whole lot happening here until you get to this incident. maybe connecting it back to the visions of Daniel 2 or Daniel 7 with the four empires. Very few people ask what is actually an obvious question, though, if you really think about it. Where does Daniel get this idea? Now, you could default and use the easy answer, oh, well, God just popped that into his head when he was writing the book of Daniel. Regardless of the fact that the book of Daniel never says that Daniel wrote it. We'll just put that to the side at this point. But you might think this is new information. It's not the case. Daniel actually has something he's drawing on that makes complete sense with this notion that there are supernatural beings over geopolitical entities, nations. And that's what we want to look at, because the history of this idea is a lot older than Daniel's time period. So I'd like to jump into this talking about Genesis 1 through 11. Again, we're only going to focus on one of the three rebellions, but you might not even be familiar with the three rebellions. So if I like to sort of break into the question this way, when I get this in Q&A or maybe on an interview or something, it usually goes something like, are demons fallen angels? What about a third of the angels rebelling? I mean, because this is sort of the way that we learn how to talk about cosmic powers of darkness. And so I have to sort of stop and say, okay, we need to get oriented here. We need to have the right orientation. So I use this question. If you were to walk up to the average Christian and ask, why is the world such a mess? Why is humanity depraved? Why do we have evil like we do? The answer that the average Christian will give you is, and this is the answer I would have given, even while I was a doctoral student in grad school, was, that's the fall. It's what happened in the Garden of Eden. Serpent, Satan, snake, all this stuff. That's why. But if you actually read, and it's a ton of stuff, the literature in between the Testaments, when the Old Testament ends, the New Testament begins, there's this whole period intertestamental. Scholars refer to it as the Second Temple period, because that's when the Second Temple's built after the exile, and then we go on into the New Testament period. So it's about 500 years, and there's a lot of stuff written. No Jew would answer that question the way that Christian just did. If you ask the average Second Temple Jew, why is the world so evil? Why are humans so depraved? How did we get into this mess? Nobody's going to say, oh, that's Genesis 3, you dummy, don't you know your Bible? The answer you would get is, well, there's actually three reasons why the world is the chaotic mess that it is. Now, the first of those three reasons is what happens in Genesis 3. Because in that story, we have the first indication that we have a supernatural being. By the way, the serpent in Genesis 3 is not just a snake. Genesis 3 is not a zoology lesson. Oh, snakes used to be able to talk, just like in the first book of the Chronicles of Narnia. No, it's not a zoology lesson. Everyone in the ancient world, you can pick any civilization of the ancient Mediterranean, when animals talked, they didn't think, oh, well, animals used to be able to talk. They thought, no, animals don't talk. The gods must be up to something. They're either inhabiting this thing or they come in the guise of this thing and they're up to something. One of the Egypt's case is the shipwrecked sailor. It's got this big serpent, that it's not a fall story, but it's a very easy, sort of parallel. What's going on here is I go through all the data in both Unseen Realm and the Demons book, and I shouldn't say all the data. I'm actually withholding a lot of information about the way I take Genesis 3. There's a lot in Unseen Realm, there's a lot in the Demons book, but trust me, I could do a whole other book on stuff that isn't in those other two books on this. We have a supernatural rebel. And this passage in Genesis 3 has connections to Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. And I know Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 are not about Satan. I know that. I understand it. It's very obvious. They're diatribes against the king of Babylon and the king of Tyre. But the way these two kings are portrayed draws on the story of a supernatural rebel in the divine council. That's what's lurking in the background. That's how the kings are portrayed. That's how their hubris and their arrogance are portrayed. Isaiah 14, the king says, I will be like the Most High. I will be above the stars of God. All of those phrases, I will ascend to the heights. Okay, this is all language for divine counsel, both within the Hebrew Bible and in other Canaanite texts. Okay, we have the story of a divine rebel who is rebelling against heavenly superior authority. And that's what happens in Eden. So we get the first figure on the supernatural side that is opposing God's will. And we also get the first human rebellion. So that's the first installment of, again, 3. So Genesis 3 is important. But we also get two more. We get the incident with Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the sons of God and the daughters of men, okay, which Peter, when he references in 2 Peter 2, angels that sinned, he puts it at the time of the flood, and they are in Tartarus, they are in the abyss, which Genesis 6 doesn't say. But the wider, again, the Greek version of the story of sons of God and daughters of men before the flood, the Titan story does have them there. And more importantly, the Mesopotamian story, that's the backdrop to Genesis 6, 1 through 4, also has them. Again, unseen realm, reversing Hermon, the demon's book has all the details. Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is about, I'll use Peter's terminology or Jude's terminology, the transgression of the boundary between heaven and earth. Okay, it is a divine rebellion. It is a divine transgression that has a dramatic impact on humans. The original Mesopotamian story accounts for every element of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Sons of God, daughters of men, this weird interbreeding sort of thing, whatever that is, going on. And it also accounts for Genesis 6, 5. Have you ever wondered when you read Genesis 6, 4, the weird stuff, sons of God, Nephilim, and all that? Then you get to verse 5, and what does it say? And God saw that the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every imagination of the thought of his own heart was only evil continually. Well, how do we get people end up like that in light of the first 4 verses? If you knew the Mesopotamian story that Genesis 6, 1 through 5 is responding to, you would know the answer to that question. And it's weird because the older Mesopotamian stuff actually is known in between the Testaments by writers of books like 1 Enoch, the Genesis Apocryphon, and a few others. They know this backstory, and they use it to retell Genesis 6, 1 through 4. The answer is that when the sons of God come down, they don't just want to create their own imagers, which is a transgression. They're mimicking God. They want their own people to be their proxies on earth. They're not authorized to do that. So that's one issue. But the other issue is that they teach humans certain things to bring up civilization. The Babylonian version of this is why Babylon was great, because the gods gave us divine knowledge. This is why Babylon is superior to everybody else. And it's why we're just at the top of the heap. To the Israelites, the Jewish authors, it's like, well, what did they teach you? And you actually get a grocery list in both the Mesopotamian stuff and, again, Second Temple Judaism. Things like astrology, arts of warfare, fashioning weapons to more efficiently kill each other, drugs, astrology. Idolatry is the big one. Arts of seduction to proliferate immorality. All these things are actually listed out in both texts. Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is sort of a little capsule form. But this is why the New Testament connects false teaching. Peter and Jude, read it. Who do they compare false teachers to? The angels that sin. Lo and behold, there's a context for that. They're sent back to the abyss, or they're in chains of gloomy darkness, as Peter has. Peter uses the word tartarao. They're sent to Tartarus, which is where the Greek Titans are imprisoned. Again, that's the Greek equivalent of this story. Mesopotamian story, they're sent to the abyss from whence they came to never return. All the elements are there. Everybody in Second Temple Judaism knows this, and they all accept it as a supernatural and human problem. Supernatural rebellion that proliferates and accelerates human depravity and self-destruction. So that's the second problem, second reason we have a chaotic mess. And the third one is Babel, and this is where we're going to park today. Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, and of course this is going to link into Psalm 82. Now, let's go to Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, but think about Genesis 11. This is the Tower of Babel story. I'm just going to take that off for the moment. If you read through the Tower of Babel story, guess what? You're not going to see any supernatural beings in there except for God. Okay? So you say, Mike, where do you get this idea? Where did Jews in between the Testaments get this idea that somehow there's a supernatural rebellion problem here along with the other Babel stuff? Because I'm reading Genesis 11, I don't see it. It's a very familiar story. Well, if you go to Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, you will see it. The problem is that most of our English translations do not use the Dead Sea Scrolls in Deuteronomy 32, 8. ESV does. The NRSV does as well. NLT probably does. It's a little hard to tell from the translation, but I think it does. But let's go with ESV. It's the most literal. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance. In other words, when the nations are formed, when these different national groups emerge and they get land. Okay, this is the result of Babel. When God confuses the languages, okay, he fragments and disperses people in judgment. At Babel, people are still not obeying what God wants them to do. After the flood, God tells Noah, okay, now we're going to repeat the Edenic idea again, be fruitful and multiply, and I want you to spread over the earth and all this stuff. We're going to try again to restore Eden, to restore what was lost. We used a flood to deal with the proliferation of depravity. We're going to try again. You go to Genesis 9:19. Let's just use the other translation for that. You get a very specific connection. These are the three sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. If you go again to the next chapter, Genesis 10, what do you get? The table of nations descended from Noah and his sons. Then Genesis 11 is the story of how these nations came to be in terms of their distribution. And that is what Deuteronomy 32 is referencing. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now, other translations, here ESV has a nice little footnote. Compare Dead Sea Scroll Septuagint. The Masoretic text, that is the traditional Hebrew text, reads sons of Israel. Like the King James, sons of it. And I grew up in the King James as a new believer. So I literally never saw this. It was invisible to me. What you say, well, what's the point here? Well, verse 9, you need to get the full point. So God divides up the nations according to the number of the sons of God. So there's some kind of equivalent being drawn. There's some kind of relationship, analogical relationship between the nations and other members of the heavenly host that aren't God, but they're part of the heavenly host. They're part of, the entourage, so to speak. And the nations are somehow aligned. Let me use Deuteronomy 4 language. They are allotted, to the members of the heavenly host, and the members of the heavenly host are allotted to them. These are the ones that the other nations worship. You, Israel, the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. You only worship Yahweh. The Lord, our God, is one. We worship only one. Okay? The other nations have other gods allotted to them. You do not worship them. They are under judgment. They are under punishment. Essentially what happens in Deuteronomy 32 is God divorces humanity. I'm done. It's our third try at this. We had Eden, then we had to do the flood, now we're here, and you're doing the same thing. You're disobeying me. You don't want me to be your God. Fine. I'm going to punish you. I'm going to allot you to other gods, other sons of God. And they're going to be placeholders. They're going to, be your supervisors now. Now, God wants them ruled well. How do we know this? Because all humans are God's imagers. And God, right after he sentences them, right after God divorces himself from the rest of humanity. So God is childless in one sense after Babel. The Adam and Eve experiment is done. But God doesn't want it to be done. He's done with these people, at least for a long time. So, because what God does right after he does this is what's the next thing that happens in the biblical storyline? He says, now watch what I'm going to do. I'm divorcing you people, and I'm going to divide you up into these national entities, and I'm going to assign other supernatural beings, to your leadership, and you're going to worship them, or you wind up worshiping them. So I'm not going to relate to you one-on-one or anymore individually. I'm done. We're done here until I say otherwise. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm not giving up on the original idea. I'm going to go to Ur of the Chaldeans because there's a guy and his wife there that are perfect for my next move. I'm going to call this Abram guy and his wife who can't have children. She's perfect. Because when I enable her to have a child, there will be no doubt among those people and the rest of you that this nation exists to be the new Adam and Eve, and they exist only because of a supernatural act of God. So they're perfect. God calls Abram. We know the story. He makes a covenant with Abram. And what does he say in the covenant? Genesis 12:3. He promises Abraham a few things, and he says, now, I want you to know that it's through your offspring that someday someone from your offspring is going to be the thing or the person through which all of these other nations will be blessed. God has not forgotten about them. He has not put them on the shelf permanently. They are under judgment. Now, in the course of the Old Testament story, people from these nations can choose to come over and believe in the God of Israel. Rahab does. Naaman does. Apparently the widow of Zarephath did too. She was willing to put her life on the line for Yahweh's prophet. By the way, the widow of Zarephath and Naaman are Jesus in his first sermon at Nazareth. They are his two examples of faith. And he pits two pagans over against the Pharisees. And that made them happy. Okay. These two obscure pagans I'll show you what real faith is. It ain't you guys. It's these two pagans over here. People could do this. But the reality is that they're enslaved. And God didn't intend for them to be directed away from him and enslaved. That's what Psalm 82 is about. God is angry with the way the situation has developed. They're created with free will, just like we are. It's one of the attributes of God. Again, this all goes back to divine imaging and what that means. God is angry with them and says, because you have sown chaos among your nations, because of the injustice that you sow among these people, I'm going to punish you. You're going to die like men. Now, it's an eschatological judgment. We know that from other passages in the prophets. We also know it from the New Testament, which we'll get to in a moment. But this is the picture. This is the third rebellion, the fragmentation of humanity. This is the reason why idolatry becomes rampant. It explains the rest of the Old Testament in a number of ways. If you want the details on, by the way, the Dead Sea Scrolls stuff, and again, if you're having trouble sleeping, okay, this is on the archive page, this article I published through Dallas Seminary's journal. So it's not a liberal journal. Sorry. There it is, Dallas Seminary. But the Dead Sea Scrolls read, he divided them up according to the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. Right, here's the text, 4Q Deuteronomy Q, and in a transcription. So, we have this situation where we have a death problem because of Genesis 3. Everything dies now. Humans are estranged from God. So that's one reason why the world's a mess. The Genesis 6 thing is really about the dispensing of divine knowledge or forbidden knowledge to help humans more efficiently destroy themselves. The Nephilim problem is taken care of by the time of David. That's a secondary concern, even though we tend to fixate on it. They were more concerned with the depravity that it created. And then the third problem is the nations are worshiping other gods. And they're slaves to those sons of God who somewhere along the line just either failed or they became corrupt or whatever, but it's not a good situation. It's something that God hates. That's why the world is a chaotic mess. We have three reasons in intertestamental Jewish thought. Now, if you believe this, you also believe that when the Messiah comes, he's supposed to fix all three, not just one. He's not here to fix Genesis 3 and leave the other two go. He is here to fix all of it. And there are lots of things in the Gospels and the epistles that say, yeah, he does that. One other note here, again, about the sons of Israel reading. Again, you don't have to be a textual critic and know about the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran. Israel didn't exist when Babel happened. So God isn't going to divide the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. There is no Israel. That comes later when God calls Abraham. Again, it's not permanent. It explains certain things in the Old Testament. You have Abram, which we just talked about. It's interesting that Israel is referred to, and every Israelite is referred to as a kingdom of priests. Yeah, Israel had a priesthood, Leviticus, we all know that. I know Leviticus is everyone's favorite book, I know. We know this, they had a priesthood, but as an entity, as a nation, they were supposed to be a kingdom of priests and a separate nation unto God. Why? God just likes when people behave oddly. No, they're supposed to be a mediator. They're supposed to be an example of what life is supposed to be like, what life could have been like in Eden, where we have the true God, his presence with us. I mean, Israel had no police force. Did you realize that in the Old Testament? There is no police force like to enforce all these laws, okay? You're supposed to be living in the most optimal way in relationship with the true God to attract people in the nations where they are enslaved and living in chaos, where there is all this wickedness, the bloodshed, the immorality, the terror. You're supposed to be an example of what they should want. But Israel fails. And they fail pretty miserably and pretty quickly, to be honest with you. And that's why we have the issue with Psalm 82. This leads to what scholars also call cosmic geography. And again, I say the Babel thing really explains the rest of the Old Testament because it explains why it's Israel against the nations, it's Yahweh against the gods. That whole situation derives from what happens at Babel, this last rebellion. Supernatural beings attached to geopolitical entities. What does that sound like? It sounds like Daniel 10. This is where Daniel gets his theology. He gets it from Deuteronomy. He gets it from the Torah. I mean, where else would a good Jew get his theology but from the Torah? Okay? It's right there, but again, we can't see it unless, again, we're reading with the best primary source material. But there are other passages that this explains as well. I'll just give you a few of them, because there's cosmic geographical things in lots of stories, both Old and New Testament. 1 Samuel 5 is when the Philistines have the Ark of the Covenant, which, it's a funny story, and I don't know why it's doing that, but let's just go to this. We'll just type it in. 1 Samuel 5. Of course, I'm assuming I can type it. The Philistines in the Ark. Let's just shut the visual filter off again. Get rid of that. So they've captured the Ark. And again, this is a story we tell in Sunday school because it's comical. When the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the Ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the Ark of the Lord. Everybody laughs. And it's funny, okay. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. Dagon needed some help. And again, the Philistines know that the idol isn't the actual deity, because if you smashed the deity, you just build a new, or you smashed the idol, you just build a new one. The logic of idolatry was people made objects, and then they would perform ritual ceremonies. The most common one is called the opening of the mouth. Egypt had it, Mesopotamia had it. It's you go through a bunch of ritual actions to animate the deity, to let the breath, let the spirit being come in and inhabit, to animate, to enliven the idol. This is the theology. It comes to live inside the object or attach itself to the object. This is the logic of idolatry. It localizes the deity in that sense for different purposes. So, there are actual Mesopotamian texts where idols get destroyed during wars, and the people don't sit down there and cry like, "Oh, our God is dead now. What are we going to do?" No, we got to go build another one. Then we got to go through the whole ceremony again, and then the deity will come and live in our little thing that we made, and everything will be great. So, idols and deities, there is a relationship intrinsically between them, but they are not the same thing. They are two related but distinct things. Okay, so we have here, Dagon falls face flat. They put him back up again. And, the next morning, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. The head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Now, again, they don't conclude, well, I guess Dagon's dead now. We don't have Dagon worship anymore. No. Only the trunk of Dagon is left. This is why. Here's the line. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. So after this time, they're going to get rid of the ark. They can't get rid of that thing fast enough after this. But they keep worshiping Dagon in the same house, the same temple. But this time, when they go through whatever they're doing, they take great care to not walk on the place where they found the idol of Dagon smashed up. Why? Because they know this little patch of dirt is under dominion of Yahweh. This is where Yahweh had victory over Dagon. He owns this land. Right here, and we aren't taking any chances. So we're going to do what we do for Dagon, but we ain't walking over that. Again, it's this notion that deities are attached to places, not just objects, but places. Let's go back here. 1 Samuel 26. I'll just summarize this one. When David gets kicked out of Judah, David holds up with the Philistines actually for a while, running from Saul. So he's outside of Judah. And David is upset, and he's complaining that, how am I supposed to pray and how am I supposed to worship the Lord when I'm not in Judah? So is David denying omnipresence? Is he a really bad theologian? No. He knows that to properly worship God, he has to be in God's land. And he's troubled by the fact that he's not. It's where he belongs. This is Yahweh's domain. It's a very simple idea, again, from the perspective of the biblical worldview. Let's go to 2 Kings. 2 Kings 5, I think I had 17 there. This is the Naaman story. Again, this is another one we tell in Sunday school because it's a great story. But do we understand what it's communicating in terms of the worldview? Cosmic geographical worldview. So Naaman, important guy, captain of, Syrian army. He's a commander. And he has leprosy. So he's complaining. We would all complain if we had leprosy, let's be honest. And a little girl in his household overhears him. She's a little slave girl that was taken from Israel as a captive in war. And she says to her master, my paraphrase here, quit griping. I'm sure she didn't say it quite that way. But what's the problem? Why don't you go to Israel and talk to the prophet, and he'll take care of your leprosy? And he's like, what? So eventually he becomes convinced, okay, we're going to take a band of men, we're going to go down there. And at first, he goes to Elisha, and Elisha won't even come out to meet him, which is a real insult. He won't even come out of the hut. Yeah, I know who it is. Just tell Naaman to go down to the Jordan and wash 7 times, and problem solved. And Naaman gets ticked. It's like, we got better rivers back in Syria than this little, mud hole. I mean, what? And so he's angry. But again, somehow his men convince him to do it. Like what's the harm? Just go ahead, just try it. And so he does. And again, we know the story. He comes out after the 7th time and he's clean. And now he's freaked out. So, I mean, you look at what he says here. Oh, let's see. He returned to the man of God, he and all his company. And he came and stood before him and he said, behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. That's a huge statement for a pagan. He's Syrian. He's not a Jew. Like, he's just denying that his own gods are legit. Okay, I know there's no God in all the earth but in Israel, so accept now a present from your servant. So he wants to give the prophet something in return. Elisha says, no, we're not going to do that. Then Naaman said, well, if you won't take it, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of dirt. For from now on, your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. Why does he ask for dirt? Because it's Yahweh's dirt. Okay? Yahweh is connected to the land. I'm going to take some dirt, all that my 2 mules can carry, and I want to take it back home. And we're not told exactly what he's going to do with it, but maybe he made a little altar at home where he can sacrifice to the Lord on the Lord's ground, even though he's not there. It's here with him. The dirt is with him. Maybe he put some in a little pouch, because he actually says, hey, I got to go into the temple of Rimmon from time to time. May the Lord pardon your servant. When my master, the king, goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, he's leaning on my arm. He's kind of old, and frail. When he bows, I kind of have to go with him. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. Is that okay? And Elisha says, yeah, that's cool. Go ahead, take your dirt. You're okay. Again, this is why, again, to Jesus, this is one of the examples, the great examples of faith in the Old Testament that Jesus appeals to, against the Pharisees. But it's cosmic geography. Daniel 10, we've already looked at a little bit. Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece. I have a little reference to the Septuagint. Septuagint is the Greek translation, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. One of the terms used in some of the Greek manuscripts for Daniel 10 is the word archon, and it's one of Paul's words for the principalities. I mean, there's other vocabulary connections between what Paul says and the Old Testament, but this is like a clear one. So how does this relate to the New Testament? I mean, we'll get back to Paul in a moment, obviously, but just a few things in relationship to Jesus. Now, we're not going to talk about the gates of hell because that actually refers to the second rebellion, the whole giant clan issue with Bashan and all that. So you can read about that in the books. But there are a couple of things, again, and I'm going to pick 2 for the sake of time here, that are really interesting. Let's see if this will click out right to the passage. Yeah. It clicks out to demons first. Oh, that's because I had the passage in here. I can just read it. So, this is the exorcism of Legion, which, again, is a story we're familiar with in the Gospels. And this is the Mark 5 record. So they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. By the way, we're not going to look at the footnotes here, I promise. But in the Demons book, there's a section of the book where I talk about the phrase unclean spirits. There's a whole scholarly book on that. It's somebody's dissertation that got published on where does the term for unclean and impure spirits come from. The short answer is, what is the concept of uncleanness and impurity in Torah? It is fundamentally about one thing: forbidden mixtures. The weird thing with the clothing, what it's made of, and you don't mix this with that, and this meat and this other. Forbidden mixtures. Why would demons be connected with forbidden mixturing? Because of Genesis 6. That's a forbidden mixture. It's a transgression of a boundary. And this is why Second Temple Judaism has its own theology that we're completely ignorant of demonology. And a lot of it is hooked back into Genesis 6, which we are taught. I was taught that there's nothing supernatural going on there. The sons of God there are just the sons of Seth. Again, the sons of God are just humans there, just like they're humans in Psalm 82. There's nothing to see here, citizen, move along. Okay, nothing to see here. This is one of the rare subjects in Second Temple Judaism where basically all of the source work, the source texts agree. A demon that you encounter in the Gospels is not a fallen angel in Jewish thought. And it's based on a few passages in the Old Testament we're not going to get to today. But a demon is the disembodied spirit of one of the dead Nephilim, one of the dead giant clans. And they go by different terms: Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, Amim, Zamzumim. There's a whole bunch of ems, okay? When you killed one, because it was spawned through a supernatural process, supernatural act, whatever that was, when you killed one, the body died and the spirit lived on, seeking re-embodiment. That's what a demon is. It is an unclean spirit because it was brought into the world through forbidden mixture. They have a whole theology of this. And you get little vestiges of this like in Isaiah 14, in Ezekiel 32, when you get these visions of the underworld, the realm of the dead, you see Rephaim in there. Okay, that's where they live. They live in hell, so to speak. Okay, so again, there's a lot of strands that bleed into the idea. But this is what Jesus is encountering here. Except we get legion. So it's the man with the unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs. Again, we know the story of what he's like. And so he says to Jesus, when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." So the spirit's legion is begging for mercy here. And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Okay. See, they're in Gentile territory. They're herding pigs here. Okay. They're herding swine there. So the place where it happens is significant because, well, I'll get to it in a moment, but just, again, this is not like your normal Jewish turf here. Don't send me out. This is where we belong. They're out in the desert. It's Gentile territory. A herd of great pigs was on the hillside, and Jesus permits the unclean spirits to go out and enter the pigs, and so on and so forth. Now, I wrote here, it's noteworthy that Jesus, again, had limited his ministry to a Jewish audience before this chapter. This is Mark 5. This would not be unexpected as Israel's Messiah. His entrance into the country of the Gerasenes, Gentile territory, in Mark 5 indicates a departure from his pattern. Now, if you compare, and these are just two passages, when he's in Galilee and he runs into, this situation, "What have you to do with us?" the demons ask, Jesus of Nazareth. But when he's outside holy ground, okay, because this is under Gentile dominion at this point in history. Now it's all of a sudden Jesus, Son of the Most High. Does the Most High sound familiar? That's Deuteronomy 32 language. When the Most High divided up the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. Okay, so even the demons know this. There it is. Sending of the 70, 72. This is only in Luke. It's Luke chapter 10. I'll just summarize it. When Jesus sends out disciples for the first time, and this is part of inaugurating, launching the kingdom of God. He doesn't send out 12. He sends out 70. Some of your New Testament translations will have 72. It doesn't matter because the same Old Testament reference is in view, and that is the table of nations in Genesis 10. If you use the traditional Masoretic text, if you count the nations, it's the number 70. If you use the Septuagint, the number 72 because they divide a couple in the Septuagint. So he sends out disciples in a number that is a symbolic number and a symbolic act to reclaiming the nations. What's the theological messaging? Jesus is saying, and by the way, this is in Luke. Luke is probably a Gentile. I would say, he's the physician, he's very likely a Gentile. He's writing to Theophilus, who again is very likely a Gentile. And he's the only one that includes this story because it's about Gentile. It's about Gentile reclamation. It's about reclaiming the nations that were divorced at Babel and assigned to other members of the heavenly host, who, again, pervert their charges and enslave their populations and turn their hearts to idolatry. Jesus is saying, yeah, I'm the Messiah of Israel, all right. I'm the son of David and the son of Abraham and all that stuff. But I just want you all to know, everybody who's watching me send out the 70, I want you all to know that what I'm doing here, starting the kingdom of God, includes every nation. I am not here to reclaim just Israel. I am here to reclaim all of it. Every last inch. Go get them. Because he gives them power over demons and stuff like this. But just the number and the act in the gospel in which it appears telegraphs certain ideas. That again, this is part of spiritual warfare. And since it's connected to the Great Commission, that's going to become important because ultimately that's what spiritual warfare is. If you go to the book of Acts and Deuteronomy 32 worldview, I spent a lot of time in Unseen Realm talking about this. And if you don't have the book, you can get the details there. But how many times have we heard this passage preached or read it? Day of Pentecost, divided tongues as a fire. Again, this is a screenshot. Divided is the Greek lemma diamorizo. Say, who cares? Big deal. We learned another Greek vocabulary word. Okay. Well, if you search for diamorizo in the Septuagint, one of the occurrences just happens to be in Deuteronomy 32:8. What a coincidence. The nations are divided tongues, okay? Oh, you say, so what? You keep reading, and the people who listened to all this real weird tongue stuff going on at Pentecost, they were bewildered. Sunkeo. If you search for that lemma, oh, what a coincidence. One of those is in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel story. If you keep reading through the book of Acts, or let's just stay in Acts 2 for this point, you get all these names of place names in Acts 2 from all the people who are there for Pentecost. The list, if you read through the list, it moves from this side, which would be your right-hand side, to the left, right to left. So it proceeds from east to west. And of course, when it hits the ocean, nobody lives in the ocean, okay, except for Crete here, but it branches up and down. All of the regions that are listed in the book of Acts correspond regionally, and in some cases by name, to the regions represented in Genesis 10, the Table of Nations. That's not a coincidence. What has happened is because of the exile. You want a good illustration of God using evil? Why do we have the exile? Idolatry. That's why Israel lost the land. They're wiped out. Northern Kingdom in 722, the Assyrians, of course, deport everybody, then they import other people, to mix the population so they're not fighting for their homeland anymore. And of course, the two tribes in the south get taken to Babylon and all that. So a lot of them remain in Babylon. And the rest, the other 10 tribes are scattered throughout the known world. Who knows where they end up? Well, what that means is that there are Jews everywhere else in the Mediterranean that cover regionally all of the turf covered in Genesis 10. The Babel event, the third rebellion. And so at Pentecost, by this time in history, people from all of these places will go to Jerusalem for Pentecost. It's what they do. It's one of the big annual events here. And in this Pentecost, when they get there, they hear something different this time. This visit's going to be memorable for all sorts of other reasons. They're present at Pentecost, and Peter in the book of Acts chapter 2 says 3,000 of them become followers of Jesus. They see what's happening with the Spirit's descent. Peter, has this sermon. This is the inauguration of the new covenant. The Spirit has come. He's come because Jesus of Nazareth, you put to death, but he rose again. He ascended to the Father. The Spirit comes, and this is the new covenant spoken of by the prophets to redeem us from permanent exile and all this stuff. And 3,000 of them believe. So what do you think they do when Pentecost is over? They go back home. So now we have the gospel seeded in every place among the nations that were disinherited at Babel. Little cell groups. This is why when Paul, on his missionary journeys, goes into a town, he already finds believers there. Like, how does that happen? It happens because of Pentecost. Pentecost is a beachhead event. It's designed to infiltrate everything else around. The whole business of Pentecost is not just to tell the Jews in Jerusalem it's time to repent. The business of Pentecost is saying we are going to reclaim the nations beginning right here. Right here. Now, there's one place, you see the red line over here to the left. This is where the list in Acts stopped. There's one place that's an outlier. It's not listed in Acts 2. And if you keep going through Acts, you see other places. Here's the Genesis 10 list. There's the line from the previous slide. You keep going in Acts, and you hit Acts 8, you get the gospel taken to Samaria. Why is Samaria important? For a couple of reasons. It was the capital of the apostate northern kingdom, the one that was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC and taken into exile. Again, the Assyrians move them out, they move people in, and the people who were left there, they intermarry with the people brought in, and they produce the Samaritans. They're half-breed Jews, which means the other Jews don't like them. This is why John chapter 4 says that the woman at the well is surprised that Jesus sits down and has a conversation with her. Because she says, look, dude, don't you know that the Jews don't have any associations with Samaritans? This is Sychar, hello? It's Samaritan territory. Jesus is like, big deal. I have something bigger in mind, okay, than this prejudicial approach. But the gospel gets taken to Samaria. We also run into, Simon Magus there. You keep reading in Acts 8, the Ethiopian eunuch. Okay, down the Nile, south. Okay, what we typically don't know is that there was a Jewish colony all the way down to the Aswan Dam. It was at a place called Elephantine. Okay, that's long before Jesus' day. So basically, there's a pattern developing here. All of the places where you have a Jewish presence, or that belong inside the parameters of the promised land, need the gospel first. Okay, it's a pattern, Jew first and then to the Greek. Now the Gentiles have been seeded all over the ancient world. But now we're going to obey Acts 1:8. You're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, and then the uttermost parts of the earth. This is what they're doing. They're doing it systematically. And Luke is recording the progression of what they're doing. So we're going to all the places that are somehow connected in the Old Testament to Jews, Jewish presence. So that's why we get an Ethiopian gets the gospel. He's reading Isaiah. Okay, he's seen it before. And he's this Jewish presence down there in Africa. Azotus was Philistine territory. The Spirit takes Philip, puts him in Azotus, supernaturally transports him there, and then he works from Azotus northward up into this strip of land, this area, again, that was Philistine territory. It still belongs to the God of Israel. And finally, you get all this. You get Saul converted in Acts 9, and now we have evangelism to the Gentiles. The Jewish stuff's covered. We're good. Time to beat Saul up on his way to Damascus and say, I have a different plan for your life, Saul. There's an internal logic to the book of Acts. And you go through, and the only place that's the outlier, let's see here. I don't know if I have it. Let's go back here to the map. The only place that's an outlier, look at the line, is Tarshish. What's Tarshish? Well, it is listed in the table of nations. But if you know your geography, what is that? It's Spain. Okay, twice in the letter to the Romans, Paul writes, he's in chains, he's on his way to Rome to stand trial before Caesar. And it's Acts 15. Paul's either a crazy man or he knows something we don't. Acts 15, I think it's 24. Oh, let's see here. Or no, it's not Acts 15, it's Romans 15, sorry. So he's writing to the Romans. He's never been there, and he wants to see the believers there. I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain. Paul, you're in chains. You're going to be put in a Roman prison, and who knows how the trial is going to turn out. Paul's like, yeah, I know, but I'm on my way to Spain. Okay. At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid and blah, 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 So you go down here and he mentions Spain again. I believe for Spain by way of you Roman guys, we'll have a great time. But I'm only going to be there a little while because I'm going to take off and go to Spain. Like, what's Spain? Paul knows it's the last place in his mission that is not accounted for in the nations that were disinherited. He is the apostle to the Gentiles. And I can't prove this, but I really believe that Paul believed he would not die until he finished the job. There's one little place I know the gospel hasn't gone to yet. So I got to get to Spain. Got to make sure we finish the job, and then, who cares? Then I can be with the Lord or whatever. But there's no other logic as to why he would even be interested. So again, you have this internal logic to the story that is linking the Great Commission, reclaiming the nations. The nations are under what? Principalities, powers, authorities, rulers, thrones, dominions. So if you look at Paul, well, here we go with the Spain, I just got ahead of myself. If you look at the vocabulary Paul uses for cosmic powers of darkness, here's the list. Rulers, principalities, authorities, powers, dominions, thrones, world rulers. He does occasionally use the word demon, in 1 Corinthians 10, in connection with the temple ritual. But this is mostly how he refers to the cosmic powers. What do they all have in common? All of these terms are used both in the New Testament and outside the New Testament in Greek literature for geographical rulership. Every one of them. This is Paul's view of his task. Paul knows he is the apostle to the places that are under the princes of Daniel 10. They are under the fallen gods of Psalm 82. And he knows Psalm 82. There's something in Psalm 82 that, again, that's hidden from our eye that I'll show you here in a minute. It's not in here, I'll just throw it in. But Paul this is how he thinks about his ministry. This is everywhere he goes, he's going into contested territory. It's just part of the job. He's not doing it in the Lord's geography. This is why Paul, I've given you a few passages here. I do have the Psalm 82 one in here. When Paul talks about the resurrection, there are about a half a dozen passages where, while he's talking about the resurrection, he doesn't focus on the kind of body we're going to have. That's typically how we think of it. He does it in 1 Corinthians 15, but then he goes off and he includes this other thought too. But in a lot of these other passages, he's not really concerned about what the resurrection means to getting a new body. He links it specifically to the defeat or the nullification or the stripping away of the power and authority of the principalities, the powers, the rulers, all this stuff. Why would he put those two thoughts together? Why would, in Paul's head, when he thinks resurrection, he thinks of their powerlessness, the lack of authority? Why would he do that? I'll just give you a couple of examples. So Colossians 2. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to the human tradition, according to elemental spirits of the world, not according to Christ, so on and so forth. So then he talks about buried with him in baptism, raised with him from the dead. And all of this, again, we could relate it to soteriology and the fact that we're brought back to God. And Paul does all that stuff, forgiveness of sins. But then he adds this thought. He set aside the record of debt, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to an open shame. So the resurrection somehow disarms them and puts them to an open shame, triumphing over them. 1 Corinthians 15:20. In fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For by a man came death, by a man has also come the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive. But each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, then it is coming those who belong to Christ, then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying. Interesting word there. Now here it's not disarming, it's destroying. We'll come back to that in a moment. Destroying every rule and every authority and power. He must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. And the last enemy to be destroyed is death. So again, he links these two things. Let's just go to Romans 15. So this one's kind of interesting. 1 Peter does this as well. It's not just Paul. For I tell you that Christ became a servant to the circumcised to show God's truthfulness in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs, and in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. As it is written, therefore I will praise you among the Gentiles and sing to your name. And again it is said, rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people. And again, praise the Lord, all you Gentiles, and let the peoples extol him. And again Isaiah says, the root of Jesse will come, even he who arises to rule the Gentiles. In him will the Gentiles hope. Somehow the resurrection has something to do with the hope of the Gentiles. But the Gentiles are under dominion. The Gentiles are under other gods. Well, Paul would say, well, those gods have been disarmed. Their authority has been nullified. I'll tell you a story. Some of you have probably heard this, but years ago, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, whatever it is, I got an email from a guy who signed the email Hercules, which, you don't get those every day. So I thought, okay, maybe I should answer this one. So it turns out this guy, he's very upfront. He says, look, he goes, I worship the gods of Greece and Rome. I'm a pagan, but I just read your little book, Supernatural, which is the light version of Unseen Realm. And he says, I just loved it. He goes, I finally found somebody that understands my worldview. So he has a podcast. So he says, will you come on my podcast and we can talk about your book? And I thought, okay, going to pagan, sure, this sounds interesting. Why not? So I go on this podcast. And Hercules happens to live in Pennsylvania, by the way. And I get on the air, and like for the first, 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, whatever it is, the audio is terrible. I mean, you can get it, but he just didn't have a good setup. The audio is terrible, but you could probably get something out of it. But for the first few minutes of the podcast, this guy is going through Greco-Roman texts, most of which I had never seen before, that articulate the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And I'm like, this is awesome. Like, I should take notes here, And he goes through all this stuff. I actually have one in the Demons book from Plato. And Plato actually uses the allotment language. The gods, we worship the gods we do because they're allotted to us by the bigger gods. It's this whole worldview, Deuteronomy 32. And so he goes through all these texts and he goes, now, I have one question for you. He says, if the Bible teaches that the Most High set up this whole system of allotment, the gods, if that's the case, what does he want? It's like, oh, I'm so glad you asked. I can feel that question. So, we went into the whole thing. We pretended to be, let's pretend to be Paul for a day. Okay, for a few minutes anyway. So Paul would go into one of these cities that you're very well familiar with, that they worship XYZ God and they believe that these gods were allotted to them. Okay, we got it. Paul goes into the city and preaches Christ. And he knows what the pagans are thinking because they share the same worldview with a key difference. Paul says, okay, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that if you come to Christ and you turn your backs on your gods, that the bigger gods say you're supposed to worship, that you're going to be in deep trouble. You're going to offend those gods, and you can expect retaliation. I get it. But let me just try to remind you of something. The Most High, okay, who is the God of Israel, not Zeus. Zeus took the title Hupsistos, which is the Most High. Let's scratch, a line, put a line through Zeus here. Okay, the Most High is the God of Israel, who set up this whole arrangement as a punishment. And that Most High made a covenant with a guy named Abram that one day one of his seed would undo this. And that seed just happened to be the Most High himself, becoming a man in Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus died on the cross for you, and he rose from the dead. And when he rose from the dead, he took away the authority that he had once given to the gods of these other places. He removed it. And the message is, here's what God wants. He says, I want you to come back to me. So you don't need to worry that you're going to get picked on by your other gods, because the Most High says it's not only okay to violate the order, he insists on it. So there you go. That's what God wants. And I like to use that illustration because here you have it, and this is unusual. This guy worships the gods of Greece and Rome, but this is the worldview. I love the Psalm 82 thing. Gosh, this is so cool. It's not my I can't open my Septuagint here, I don't think. But in Psalm, I'll just summarize it. You can look it up later. Psalm 82, remember the last verse where the psalmist says, "Arise, O God, and take the nations." Remember that? In the Septuagint, the Psalms are numbered a little bit differently. In the Septuagint, this is Psalm 81, not 82. And if you look at the last verse, the verb for rising up is the Greek verb anistemi. It's one of two primary verbs used of the resurrection in the New Testament. The noun, anastasis, is the noun for resurrection. So Paul, he uses it in Isaiah 11. He uses it, he sees it in Isaiah 11. He sees it also in Psalm 81. And so this is why, from the Old Testament, Paul understands that the rising of the Messiah is related to the reclaiming of the nations. And he'll dip into that information periodically in his letters. Now, again, to summarize the rest, because we're at noon, we need to break. What's going on, then from this point forward, I can summarize it this way. In Romans 11, let's just go there. We'll take the fast track here. If you want to know what spiritual warfare is, this is the Old Testament context for it. But in a nutshell, this is what it means for us. So Paul says, again, writing to the Romans, "Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." In other words, there's going to be a point where God is satisfied that people from every nation have been reclaimed into relationship with him. That's the Great Commission. All authority. This is Matthew 28. The Great Commission is not Matthew 28, 19 and 20. It's Matthew 28, 18 through 20. Verse 18 should not be lopped off because it says, "All authority is given to me in heaven and on earth." Who had authority up to the time of the resurrection? The gods, the principalities, the powers. They were appointed. Yeah, they're jerks. They don't rule like God wants them to. God has to say, well, at some point you're going to get destroyed. I'm going to destroy you all. And God knows, again, from some of these Septuagint passages, that this is linked to the resurrection of the Messiah. But you loop full around, there's going to come a time when God decides that the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved because, again, if you keep reading in Romans, this is going to lead to the awakening of Israel. And then we're going to have the day of the Lord. And then we're going to have the return of Christ. And then we're going to have the end. Okay? The end defined as the new Eden. Okay, this is eschatology in real, in a thimble. So for some reason, again, known only to God, God has linked the coming of the Lord, the return of the Lord, and the destruction of the principalities and powers. Destruction, not just their nullification of their authority, but their destruction. He has linked that to the end, and he's linked all that to the fullness of the Gentiles being brought in, which is linked, of course, to the Great Commission. So whenever I get asked the question about spiritual warfare, tell us about spiritual warfare, I ask this question. What would a principality and a power fear? I'll tell you what they fear. They fear their own destruction. So the thing that can instill the most fear in them is if the church, being defined as every individual Christian, would just do their job. Because it's as the one kingdom grows, the other kingdom diminishes. And we inch further and further and further down the line to the fullness of the Gentiles. They know it's coming. So they don't think they can kill God and win that way. But if they can get the church distracted, if they can make it hopelessly worldly so that its message is invalidated, so that the Great Commission sort of screeches to a halt or slows down, they're going to be here a long time. And they know it. So these things are related. So what spiritual warfare really is accomplishing the Great Commission. It's actually not terribly complicated. But we tend to not want to look at things so simply, but it is that simple. And in the end, we could talk maybe in Q&A about what this means for the believer and how the believer inherits the nations. 1 Corinthians 6:3, when Paul says, quit squabbling and suing yourselves. You Corinthians, good grief. Every day of the week you got some other problem. Quit doing that, because don't you know you're going to rule, you're going to judge angels? Don't you know that? You're going to replace and displace them. They are under judgment, and you are what's going to be moved into the slot. You are going to replace all that has been lost in the heavenly council. You are going to graduate to occupy those places. This is why Revelation 2, Revelation 3 uses, in one case, a messianic psalm that to him that overcomes, I will put him over the nations. He will rule the nations with a rod of iron. That's a messianic psalm Jesus quotes about you. This is your destiny. Who rules the nations now? Well, the gods in one sense, because they're not running home. What they're about is they know their authority has been taken away. They know their days are numbered, attached to the Great Commission, to the fullness of the Gentiles. But they're not going anywhere. They are fighting for their turf. And the way they fight for their turf is destroying people. That's effective. Okay? Getting people to destroy themselves is even more effective. Now you're working smart, not hard. Okay? And getting the church off track when it comes to fulfilling the Great Commission. It's a very discernible, coherent plan. And it's right in front of our faces. It's not complicated. They're not going away. But what the scriptures are trying to convince believers to is they don't have any authority where they're at. They think they're going to lie to their populations. They're going to lie to people. They're going to deceive people. They're going to do anything they can to get people to realize God wants them back. They're going to deflect attention. They're going to substitute themselves for the truth of what God has. Anything they can do to blind their populations and destroy them, that's what they're going to do. They have a game plan and they're working it. We have a game plan too, but the question is, are we working it? So, and again, this is ultimately what it is. So, Cody, why don't you dismiss us, and we will call it done at that. And again, we can loop back to some of these things in Q&A if you like, or go somewhere else. It's up to you.